This is On Diversity, a podcast series by the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. This is the third season, and I'm your host, Liang Kaixin, Associate Director of IPS and also a former journalist. Today's episode is in conjunction with IPS's annual flagship conference, Singapore Perspectives 2023, and the theme is Racism at Work. We have Dharesheni Nedumaran, Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, APAC at Mediabrands. We also have Shamil Zainuddin, IPS's Research Associate, who specializes in applied ethnography and also does research on race and religion issues. Welcome to the podcast today.
Hi.
Thanks for having me.
Hi. So I'd just like to get started. How should we approach or start conversations related to race at work? I guess I'll go to Shini first, since you are in the corporate world.
I think it's really important to understand first where we are in our journey and what maturity level we are before we can start that conversation. There might be naturally conversations happening. Our purpose isn't to silence them, but to give them a platform. And when I say what maturity level, it's about whether we have a common language to begin with. Have leaders been shown as role models in having these conversations? Is there specific reasons why we're having these conversations? So having any conversation about diversity, having conversations about race is a high context conversation. So we need to understand the context first. And then only then can we create an environment where that conversation can thrive. That's the difference between having conversations in a safe way versus letting it just happen online in a very anonymous and low context, creating a lot of tension kind of a way.
Okay. So for Shamil, you are with IPS right now, but
Yes,
you
I
used to
am
be from
right
the
now.
corporate world also, right?
Yeah.
So in your perspective then, how would you approach it?
You know, the idea of race is a very, I would say, it's a weird topic in the sense that, while race is really a part of our everyday in terms of policy, you've got the EIP, you've got CMIO, you've got GRC connected to race. It's really part of our everyday, but on an everyday basis with regard to people, it's a sensitive topic, right? We don't really talk about it as much. In fact, sometimes when we talk about it, we approach it via, if during racial harmony days, we would actually say, okay, if we don't do this, then maybe racial riots will start. Right, and in my opinion, that's the wrong way to approach it, right? Because the idea is this: if I'm not nice with you, you'll beat me up, or we'll have a fight or something like that, right? As opposed to actually appreciating the other person, for who the other person is, or wants to be, and so on and so forth. So, and to me, that's the wrong kind of approach. And this idea of like someone will hurt you if you're not nice to the other person, and this would sort of have an impact on things like, for example, since I'm afraid of the other, right? Then maybe I won't hire the person. I don't want to deal with the difficulty, right? And that's or I don't want to interact with the person, right? Because then I don't have to deal with this whole thing of the minefields of dealing with minority people.
That's very harmful, right? I mean, that's precisely the point about talking about race at work, because if you don't even want to hire them, then I think that's like the biggest discrimination you can ever have, right?
Yeah, because who will say I'm a racist, right? That you will never hear that, right? I can understand the unintended effects of talking in that way, right? Which is, I just don't want to deal with this this trouble of dealing with minorities. So maybe I won't hire as many. I won't have to deal with people who speak different languages, who eat different food, and all these restrictions. So I just don't have to deal with this. Yeah. So I mean, I like what Shini mentioned. Where are we at the in the organization? Why do we need to do this? I think it's an excellent question that needs to be raised. Are there even minorities in the company to begin with? And I also like what Shini mentioned about the management, because I think it needs to come from the top, right? There needs to be a green light. We can talk about this, right? So there's this idea that we can all relax once the so-called bosses relax, right? If you go to a party, it's only when the bosses relax that everyone can kind of relax a bit. So if the bosses talk about it first, then we have the onboarding perhaps of new people, and then it becomes the work culture. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for Shini then, since you are working on D&I, right, diversity and all that, so do you advise companies to hire people of other races? How do you approach this issue about hiring?
So that's a really good question. I want to go back to something Shamil said just a few seconds ago. He said, is there even people of different races. And I think there is always going to be diversity. Depends what kind of diversity. There is no such thing. We don't hire robots. So there is no such thing as a completely homogeneous population. So we start at whatever starting point we are at when it comes to recognizing diversity. Maybe a company isn't ready to have a conversation about race just yet. And I always recommend let's start with what's safe first. Maybe it's a conversation about gender and then expanding that to talk about how there's different forms of diversity. So now that we're having conversations about gender, how can we have a conversation about, hey, let's look around. Do we actually see this cultural diversity among us? Do we see national diversity among us? Do we see ethnic and racial diversity among us? Do we see diversity in terms of abilities? I think all of these conversations are essentially the same conversations, just nuanced conversations, so we can pick any starting point.
So would there be any HR processes in place to correct people's subconscious ethnic biases, be it for hiring or managing workers and colleagues in the company?
Absolutely, there should be. And this is what excites me about TAFEP and us moving towards enshrining some of this in law. To me, what that does, it is setting a minimum baseline so nobody gets left behind. I think it's really hard because not a lot of us know what best practice is. And the marker on what best practice is keeps shifting. Even our ideas of what racism is keeps shifting, right? So when we enshrine that in law, we're giving everybody a baseline on what is it that is acceptable at least to do. Some companies are going to be a lot ahead of that. They're going to have the expertise to be able to do that. Now let's talk about what that means and what exactly that looks like. We want to hire and give people a fair chance of coming in, which means we've got to check some of our biases, the ones that Shamil talked about a little bit ago, where I don't know, so I might not even be cognizant that I'm doing this, but I'm going to just avoid the I don't knows. So those are what we call biases that are happening, some conscious, some unconscious. Now, as a person who's trained in psychology, I find it really hard to say, let's just make people not biased, because that's not possible. We are built with biases, and that's just our survival requirement. So what I say is, let's shift away from just focusing on removing the bias out of everyday people. Let's make sure the processes we have, those are less susceptible to bias. So which means when it comes to hiring, there's some really interesting things that are happening with technology. It's not completely foolproof yet, but one of the things we as an organization are looking at is how can we introduce blind CV screening? So if we take names out of it, because research has clearly shown that people, as much as they don't want to be racially biased, when they look at ethnic names, they're less likely to hire. And research on that has even been done in the Singaporean context. Right? So if we take name out of it, even at that first stage, if we take age, all of these little details that don't actually matter out of it, then we're actually assessing the person for the qualities, the capabilities, and the potential. So that's one thing. We also need to make sure it's not just at the hiring stage, right? At the performance review stage, very similar to what Shamil said about we don't know, so we stay away. So research in the US, in other contexts, have shown that when managers want to give advice or feedback to someone of a different race, they tend to hold back because they're really unsure of how to do this. They don't want to make a mistake, you see? So what they do is they don't give feedback. And then now we end up setting up a system of inequality because marginalized communities don't get feedback in a timely fashion, and then they're unable to course correct, do things, get coached, improve themselves. So then they're less likely to get better promotion opportunities in the future. So what we do in the process terms for human resources and people management is we make sure feedback is given consistently. And feedback is recorded. Where data allows us to check that feedback, we can even look in and study and see, are there certain trends? Are certain people getting more feedback, less feedback? So that will, again, prevent us in setting up biases that are inherent and allowing those to lead to inequalities.
Okay, so actually what you touched on is quite interesting, especially about the blind CV and all that. I mean, Shamil, we watched the CNA show and then they actually did an experiment, right? And then in the end, the Malay candidates are paid like $200 less, right? And also about having to give feedback consistently. This is what I heard back in another workplace, that there's an ethnic minority that she said that, oh, you have given me bad feedback about my work. Is it about my race? You get what I mean? And we hear it sometimes. And as a person of the majority race, I was uncomfortable because I can't tell whether is it about performance or is it playing the race card. So Shamil, how do we navigate this?
Yes, there's no easy answer to navigating this, almost like a minefield, right? As I think Shini has pointed out really well, even definitions change, how we approach people sometimes change, what is considered to be okay yesterday is not okay today, I mean, one example I can think about previously, the idea, the show Benny Hill, when I was growing up, it's comedy, right? And I can't imagine Benny Hill being okay now, right? It was
I
on
don't know
TV.
what is Benny Hill actually.
Oh dear, am I that old? I don't think so. Okay, Benny Hill is basically this British comedian. It's a show basically, and sometimes it's a bit more, the jokes are a bit more body, B-A-W, yeah, with more sexual jokes and more sexist.
Okay.
And I can't imagine it being okay now. And this is just like maybe a decade or a few decades ago. I'm not that old, by the way, but I'm saying that norms change, right? And when it changes, then people are trying to figure out what the norm is. Now, with regard to the race cup, and this relates to perception, right? So the idea is, and that's where perhaps things like the company's policies and so on and so forth, so that the worker themselves has confidence, right, that when this performance thing is done, race is not a part of it or has been reduced. The probabilities has been reduced. It's difficult to say zero, right? But it's been reduced a bit, as Shini has pointed out really well. It's like bias. Everyone has it. It's just a matter of whether you realize it or not, right? You're aware of it and you do something about it. So having the processes in place gives you confidence, right? Like for example, I think some of our surveys show that Singaporeans have high confidence in our COVID restrictions in Singapore, right? Because of the confidence in the government, right? So if the employee is confident with the different processes in place, then perhaps that can be lowered, right? Because as minorities, perhaps they have this thing in mind. Is it, this idea, is it me? Is it really? Because I see other people, they seem to be okay. So instead of ignoring it, right, companies can take that step to say that, hey, we're doing these things. I've worked in MNCs before. I've never had the D&I kind of, diversity and inclusion kind of department. So I think that's a huge start, and it's wonderful actually. And as a result of that, there's a cascading thingy. I mean, that is a message that the company is saying, I'm actually putting in money, I'm hiring people because this is the kind of culture I would like to have. And, just want to connect to one of your questions earlier about what some companies can do and so on and so forth. I think for HR, research shows that if HR is itself diverse, right, they might help hire, they might help with diversity, because there's a tendency to sort of hire people of the same like. So for example, if it's all male, maybe you will hire more males, for example. If it's all one particular ethnic group, then you hire higher chance of hiring that one, that particular ethnic group or age and so on and so forth. But, but I'm really happy about DI, being the right move basically in companies, yeah. But I do know about smaller businesses, right, and whether they can have this kind of, so maybe that we can touch on that as well later on. Not just the huge MNCs they can afford D&I, but the smaller businesses, the SMEs, and so on and so forth. So how do we deal with that? I don't know why I'm asking the question, right? I'd be interested to know your opinion about
how about
smaller businesses. And how do we? How do we approach those kind of businesses? Yeah,
you are absolutely right. I love that organizations are starting to think about DEI. And what I say is, not all of them will need to hire an expert, such as myself, to lead those things. Because there are people that are passionate about it on the ground, and they are everywhere, including in smaller businesses. We have marginalized communities living among us in every sense of the word. So these people already are passionate, small companies can just give them space for their passion. Let them lead the charge. We are seeing so much more employee-led initiatives. Companies empowering them and not just trying to control them is the way to go. Within small companies, there's so much government grants available already that helps you think about how you can, as a recruiter, as a HR professional, be less biased in your work. How can you, as a recruiter, be trained to spot biases and feedback? You don't need me to come in and tell you exactly what you're doing wrong. There's books you can read. There is courses you can attend, e-courses available, free content there that just allows you to own self train your skill set.
Like that.
Okay, but coming back to TAFEP, right? So I guess if small companies did not have their own resources for this, then I guess they will also look to the government for guidelines and what they can do and what they cannot do. So I guess it's going to be enshrined into the law, right? Anti-discrimination Act. So, I mean, what do you think? What are some of the baseline guidelines that we should have for these small companies?
I mean, just talking about the TAFEP being enshrined in law, right? I mean, I think it is a step in the right direction, in the sense that, okay, this is something that, as a whole, Singapore is against. And we are taking the serious steps to sort of ensure that this doesn't happen, or at least, that we minimize it, or we sort of address it, as opposed to just sweeping it under the carpet, right? So they give some kind of powers to TAFEP. But, and I think the government also is quite, because I was reading about it some time ago, and they also know that, perhaps a punitive way might not be the best, right? So meaning we should start with mediation first, more informal kind of talks between the different parties before going to the more legal side of things. Because, as a student of sociology also, I'm like, thinking of the latent or unintended effects of such laws, right? Because whatever policy you have, whatever law that you might have, it will never make you force you to love another person. You cannot do that, right? It can help nudge, right, by giving a certain culture, right? But it cannot force you to say, I care about that person. So I'm always thinking of the unintended effect. I'm sure policymakers are as well, right? So, for example, because of having such things, right, will organizations, right, say, hey, again, we have this new law, this TAFEP, and it's connected to minorities of all sorts. Let's have less minorities, so we lower the probability. We have one or two, maybe, just to say we have, but we don't want to. I'm thinking of some company. I'm sure not all are like that, but I'm just thinking of the unintended effects of such laws. And I think you mentioned about baseline things, and it is about the nudging effect, or the kind of encouraging of the mediation and talking these things out, creating a culture of getting to know one another, getting to know, being comfortable with differences, and to know that, like what you mentioned also, this is not right. Right, and this is okay, for example, because sometimes in this sometimes foggy world of race and discrimination, you just don't know actually, like what is it actually. It's just sometimes quite, even for academics, by the way, it sounds like academics kind of know, but if you read the literature, there's like a billion different definitions on what racism is, for example. Although the basic idea is clear, but when it gets more nuanced and everything, it gets a bit more difficult. I would say that way.
Yeah, but coming back to Shani, right? Because when we talk about discrimination at work based on race and all that, how do we define it? Like just now, what I said about race card and all that. How do we know that something is reportable? Like, for example, we had an IPS research, right, that says that 1/3 of minority race respondents felt discriminated against at work. But in the end, TAFEP also had some survey, and then when they looked through, right, so 2/3 of reported cases are not substantiated, right, and then the majority are misunderstandings that are subsequently clarified and not pursued further. So how do we go through this messiness actually?
People might perceive that there's discrimination. And that's important enough to address because we see, research shows, we know that the perception of racism is enough for it to have negative outcomes, be it in mental health of marginalized communities or be it at business outcomes. Just thinking that you're going to be discriminated against gives you performance anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah. It activates something called stereotype threat, and it makes the person perform at a lower level. So we need to address the perception, even if it's real or not real. Now, how we address it, that's your question, right, Kaixin?
Yep.
It really helps that companies have their own anti-discrimination policies where they define clearly what is it, and it's going to be really hard to cover everything, right? But create a culture where we can still go to HR and talk about it. Not everything is going to end up in a, this is formal action, this is racism, we're going to do something. We need to have two ways of talking about race or discrimination at work. One is a formal pathway, one is an informal pathway. The formal pathway, you must clearly tell people what will happen if you come and report something to us. Because if one of the things I think IPS also found is that people don't know what to do if they notice a colleague being discriminated against or doing something that is discriminatory. And they don't know what to do, so they don't do anything. I tell you, people also might experience this, and because they don't want to poke the bear, they just let it pass. And then this is how we continue snowballing and continuing with race issues at work, not getting addressed. So we need to make it very clear what happens if you come and report something to HR. And what we're doing in our company right now is making that process very clear, deciding who will investigate. There must be different pathways for reporting because you're not going to feel safe. Let's say the HR is the person who is being problematic. We need to have different pathways. So what we do is we have one pathway, you go to HR. One pathway, you go to manager. Manager will then assess which cases will they go straight to HR or go to the HR director. Or anonymous pathways for reporting. Or a group level whistleblowing pathway for reporting. So all of these ensures that people feel safe to say something. Then when they not just feel safe, you need to tell them, anytime you say something, there is no retaliation while we're investigating, as long as your report is in good faith. Meaning you've given us information that is accurate based on your experience or something you've witnessed. Now, whatever the outcome, we're not going to retaliate against you because we could find out that at investigation, it's a misunderstanding, we land on something, but that's not going to affect you and your standing in the company. We're going to have to keep it confidential to prevent that from affecting you. So the other thing that's really important to do is got to train these people who are the first responders to any of these reports. And I think this is where a lot of companies are sort of missing out right now. So one of the things we're doing right now is we're running a training for all of our HR folks who are most likely to be the first responders across APAC actually, but in Singapore as well. And we're training them to be first responders, be it a race-related issue, sexual harassment-related issue, mental health-related issue, disability request for disability accommodations. Can you respond in a sensitive way? Don't accidentally ask the question that turns a person off. And maybe, in fact, even leads to a suspicion that, you're not going to take this seriously. Why bother? Right? So when we do these things, that reporting pathway, the formal reporting pathway, it becomes a lot more accessible. We also need to consistently market that this exists. And I think that's one of the things TAFAP is going to help do. It's going to push companies to have a conversation they might have previously avoided.
Okay.
So when I talk about informal pathways, now we need to create a culture where, I know the Western idea is the calling out, calling in. I think about it as a culture where, and in our company we use the language forbid and forgive. Let's create a culture where it's okay to be wrong sometimes. We all know we are doing it in good intentions. Can we disagree, but disagree in a healthy way? And when we create that culture, then people won't just hold it back and only use the formal reporting pathways. They will be more likely to talk about it if you create that safety. And I know that's a very hard thing to do. It's not a one-off thing. It is a long-term change to create, but it's a long-term change that has business value benefits.
I really like what Shini mentioned with regard to this culture of being forgiving, right? And this connects to being kind, which should be a culture as well, right? Because, a lot of these companies, perhaps this is their first foray. They have decided that they want to be more inclusive, more have, expand the idea of diversity and so on and so forth. And they're hiring minorities or people with different abilities and stuff like that in the company. And along the way, they might make mistakes, right? And hopefully the minority accepts that, the spirit of this move is that we want to be more inclusive. We want to have, want to expand the idea of diversity in this organization. But along the way, in getting to know you, we might step on some toes or whatever, like make some mistakes. And I hope, that you can tell us, you can sort of correct us, and it's fine for you to correct us. Of course, there are major mistakes that might be, you might require legal kind of thing. But those are major. I'm talking about the other kind of mistakes. For example, even our names, right? I think before this we're talking about names, right? We're just getting to know each other and trying to figure out, because we want to be polite and we want to know how to pronounce each other's names, right? But we might mispronounce. People mispronounce my name all the time, right? But the thing is, okay, but I understand, but the spirit of that is you want to get to know me, right? And I will tell you how to pronounce it. You might get it wrong after the third time or so, but still, right? The spirit of that is you want to get to know me, and I accept that, and I accept that we might make mistakes along the way. So I really appreciate what she talked about just now. It's not just about the workplace; it's about just living with differences, right? Living with people with so-called who might be different, have different cultures, eat differently, so on and so forth. Yeah, just want to emphasize that bit. Oh, and one bit also is this idea of culture, because she said so many things that I thought was cool. So this idea of culture at the workplace, right? Again, being a person who is interested in culture itself, right? Maybe some of these companies can think about, if I look around my workplace, right? Does it look like the Singapore that I want it to be, right? Is this just, is it mono, certain age, mono ethnic, mono whatever, right? And are we comfortable with that? Are we comfortable with it being, doesn't represent our customer base, for example? Does it represent the Singapore that we live in? Do we want to do something about it? Is it all males? That's another thing. Or all a certain race? Yeah. And connected to that is this idea that we have not talked about, actually, that why should we have diversity, actually? We're interested in profits. Why should we have diversity, right? So a way to answer that is, other than, diversity is great, different ideas and everything else, this idea of what if we don't address these things, right? And I think what Shini mentioned just now, this idea of, people being anxious, anxiety, and so on and so forth, right? It affects so-called minority population, right? And not addressing it can cause, other negative effects. You got a whole population here who might be really upset, and then everything will be, is it because of race? That's why I don't get hired. Is it because of race I'm not promoted, right? So if we do not address it, we are not addressing this perception, whether real or not, right? Because whether real or not, people act upon the perception, and that action has real consequences, right? And that's why perceptions matter. What Shini mentioned just now, yeah. So great stuff, Shini. I just wanna.
Okay, so actually I also want to go back to a point Shini brought up about having a list of items or things that are acceptable and unacceptable, right? Because when we talk about racism and all that, there's also like microaggression and versus biases versus like outright hard no. How do we define it? How do we know that it is harmless, or is it just micro, or is it something that it has to be reported?
Ooh, that's a tough question, because I'm going to say, again, all diversity conversations are high context conversations, right? So it depends on the content itself. And one of the things I'm going to say is that just because we think a microaggression isn't harmful doesn't mean it isn't. So microaggressions are what we think about as casual, unintentional, things that are said or done. Now, one of the concepts I try and discuss when I talk about racism or discrimination is there's intention, then there's outcome. A lot of times we don't intend for any of it. It's just a joke, right? We don't intend for any of it to be racist. But the outcome is what really matters. We have to separate these two because we can tell people when we address, hey, that's led to a structurally or an unequal outcome, unfair outcome. But we know your intention wasn't there. But let's do something so we stop that outcome. So going back to microaggressions, it's casual, it's unintentional a lot of times, but there is a very dangerous outcome. I like to use mosquito bites as an analogy for explaining the effect of microaggressions. For a couple of us, mosquitoes don't love our blood. For me personally, I don't get bitten that much, honestly. I'm lucky living in Singapore. Some people, I don't know what it is, maybe where they are, maybe it's their blood types, they get bitten a lot. For the some of us who get bitten once or what, twice, it's not a big deal. It's just a mosquito, right? It's just a bite. Why are you making so much noise about it? But for those of us for whom a microaggression happens so often people misname me or would say something like, oh, can I just call you D? No, my name comes with this beautiful heritage. You can't just call me that. But the more that happens, the more I realize what my place is. I guess I am just that person. I'm less. I am less. And that message comes across to marginalized communities so much. And that's what's dangerous. That's the outcome of a microaggression. When it layers on, some mosquito bites are lethal.
Wow, I like it. I like this mosquito bites. And this idea of the microaggression, right? The idea, it sounds like, it sometimes tries to sort of, not say belittle it, because it sounds, micro is like, but actually microaggressions is basically because of the micro interactions, right, between people, is the everyday interactions. It's nothing so-called, it can lead to really harmful or hurtful things, right? Exactly what Shini mentioned. And as she mentions, it might be unintentional, sometimes intentional though. But there's this saying in Malay, sikit-sikit jadi bukit, meaning a bit become mountain, right?
Okay.
In almost a literal way, right? So a bit, So when you first, you a new person, a new graduate, right? Fresh graduate, first job. You may have, perhaps you're in a meeting and suddenly someone speaks to you, speaks in a different language you don't understand, right? For example, speaks in Mandarin, right? And this is a common example that people always cite. You're in a meeting, someone gives a joke, a proverb and in a different language, and no one translates it for you, right?
Yeah, at least you translated what is sikit-sikit, right?
Because my Malay is not that good, so I have to translate for myself sometimes. So anyway, and no one translates it, right? So it becomes, I'm not part. And then that's the first. So you're okay. You brush it off, right? That one mosquito bite, whatever. To use your, you brush it off, right? But years of doing this. What if you work 10 years, 20 years? And every other time, it happens so often that it just becomes, it's just a reminder that you are a minority. One thing is about, being a minority is one thing. Being reminded that you're a minority, you're different, you're another, you're not in the in-group is another thing altogether, right? You've got the speaking in a different language in meetings, right? And I have an example of how, perhaps the more informal way of kind of managing that I've heard. I can talk about it later. So you've got that the talking in different languages in which is common. I've presented to all the way to senior levels, and even at senior levels, people talk about it, right? As an issue for minorities, even at senior levels. Another thing is the name thing, right? Another example in one of our research is actually a person. I can call the name because it's a common name. This person who is a call center person, right? The name is Nabil, basically, right? And the call center, his boss basically said, "Hey, your name sounds like a Chinese swear word, right? Nah, something, right?" So and people will call display, and they're not usually not happy. And they will scold. They say, "Oh, your name is Nabil, Nated," right? So that might happen, right? And she said it in front of his colleagues, and she said, "Your name is difficult to pronounce. People will swear at you," and everyone's laughing. And then he's like saying, "My name is just too Nabil, it's like too very simple thing to pronounce." But they were laughing, and he really felt really belittled. And people after that, then they said, "Now your name is Bill. You are Bill." right? Remove all the, like you mentioned, the beautiful, the meaning of the name and so on, the name that the father or parents gave and all the whatever connected.
So it's an anglicized name,
Bill. That's right. So when people call you, just Bill. And his name stuck with him for a long time, became his business card and everything else, right? But he really felt really upset by it. Now, the intention of the boss is so-called to protect this person, Nabil, right? But the effect, right, is again, like I mentioned, if this is like first thing, maybe your first grade, okay lah, maybe it's funny, hee hoo hoo. After 15, 20 years of this, it just, you feel affected. How come people can't pronounce Nabil, for example? Or don't you want to know me? That's another issue. Names, another issue. Now, going back to the speaking in different languages in meetings, right? And this connects to this idea of we don't have to wait for top-down approach to think, right? We can do it every day, right? If you accept that the idea, the culture, the values of being a Singaporean, for example, living in multicultural Singapore, and this example, there was this meeting, right? Again, another research, and the person reported there was this meeting, and the person presenting was presenting only in Mandarin, right? And she couldn't understand anything. Obviously, she's this Malay lady, but then she got messages, WhatsApp messages. Her colleague, her Chinese colleague, messaging her, translating the entire meeting for her.
Wow, that's a lot of effort.
Yeah, just translating the entire. And I saw the messages, you see, because she screen grabbed and sent me just to prove that she's not lying, right? So so he translated the whole meeting without her asking, right? So can you imagine? So you don't have to wait for a top-down approach, right? We can be nice to another. We can just think, hey, there might be somebody who might be different, might not understand this thing. A friend, who might not understand it, and I want that friend to not be excluded from this thing, right? So so we can do that as well. We don't have to wait for policies and whatnot, right? And just be nice. And if this is the kind of Singapore that you want to be, then you sort of act upon it, basically, the values that you think that you would like to see in other people. Yeah. So, and I've seen many of those examples happening. So policy is one thing; it signals a certain kind of value, but on the ground, we can do our own bit to make someone feel included. Yeah.
Yeah, so we were also talking about SMEs just now, right? When we're talking about TAFEM and all that. And when we're talking about languages, there's quite a bit to go to educate them also, right? Because like it or not, in Singapore, the environment here, a lot of SMEs are predominantly of, the majority race, the Chinese race. So if the company is small and then is mainly of the same group of people, then perhaps what I've observed over the years or so, like they seem to lack sensitivity about these kind of issues and all that. For big companies, you can have the department and all that. I think, Shani, you talked about this point just now. But as a society, then how do we have this sensitivity about it without making it like a us versus them kind of situation?
Yeah.
Shani, what do you think?
I think Shamil has actually already given us the answer.
Okay.
And he uses the word kindness and niceness. I like to use the word empathy. I think we're starting to move to an economy where soft skills are so heavily valued. And to me, being empathetic is one of the most important soft skills, not just in the workplace, but for just humanity. So empathy is partly being able to put yourself in another person's shoe. And that's a really important aspect of it. The moment we start training that, and it starts at a school level, thinking not just critically, but thinking empathetically, and a workplace level, as a nation, constantly having that as our value, I think that's what is going to move the needle on this. A lot of times, and I go back to a research point, there's a big buzz in the corporate world around unconscious bias training. Personal opinion, you just mandate people attending unconscious bias training, it might even backfire. But the unconscious bias trainings that do work are the ones that actually train empathetic response.
Okay, can you give some examples?
Yeah, I just want to know. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going back to Shamil's story about that person who was in a situation where there was a meeting and it was all in a language they didn't understand. The reason the colleague translated it is because they put themselves in the shoe and realized they're going to feel excluded. And so they gave an empathetic response. So there are many such incidences where that happens. In the example with Nabil, where someone may have made a joke about his name, that happens so often for people of marginalized communities. Then an empathetic response from someone of a majority group, or just an empathetic response from someone who's been in that same situation, that would create a buffer for Nabil. It's a micro-affirmation in response to a microaggression. So all of these moments where if we as a community become a lot more empathetic, we are finding an antidote that will push us towards being in a place where we can have sensitive conversations. So I'm sorry I can't give you more examples, but I use Shamil's ones.
Yeah, I'll give you more examples.
Sure.
Then you can say what I should have done. For example, right, in this micro kind of thing, this idea of, okay, maybe we should, as in call out, call in, call whatever, right? So, I remember a very senior person in my one of my companies, right, talking about drivers. And he said, and he called drivers Ahmad.
Oh.
Right? So he said, I need to hire an Ahmad or Ahmad, something like that. I just hire one Ahmad lah. And just a very senior person in this MNC, right? And in front of me, he just talks about it in front of me, right? As if it's normal, right? Because I'm guessing it is very normal in his world, right? In his pond of people or whatever. And it's normal to say that, and everyone probably says it, and it's no one bets an eye, or no one cares, lah, right? So he said it for me, and I am usually, unfortunately, the only minority, lah. Usually, or in certain offices, right? So I was like, okay, what do I do? So I actually, went to him and said, hey, maybe you shouldn't use the word Ahmad. You just say driver, lah. Why do you need to use Ahmad? It can be two things, right? It can be, number, it can be seen as being racist at that term. Number two is it can be religiously, hurtful also, because Ahmad is actually the name of the Prophet also, right? It's Muhammad or Ahmad. So I say it can be both. It's a proper minefield, basically. And then his response was, and I say it very nicely, and then his response was, I use it all the time. Why are you so sensitive? And it's a very common response, right?
Yes.
Why are you being sensitive, right? And it's used, because, I used to study and teach also gender studies also. And it's very common for women also, as being that, again, the noisy minority, the noisy, the lady who likes to complain a lot or whatever, right? So it's, again, used again on minorities in general, right? You're just too sensitive, lah, Shamil. And at the point of time, I just, I really didn't know what to do. I was like this junior person. But,
there's a power imbalance also, right?
But what I did was, I tried to be this person's friend, a very senior person, where I just when I go to eat, I will really talk to him a bit more about it, and to be closer with him, right? As opposed to really avoid him altogether. I don't work with him. He just sometimes enters my office. But yeah, just to sort of build that kind of rapport. And then give that kind of opportunity to talk about it later on again. I don't know whether he still uses this. Obviously, I'm not going to name him, but there's an example, and there are multiple examples, right? Whether it be during interviews, people ask, "Are you religious or not?" As a way of asking whether you drink, for example, right? There's another common way of asking this thing, because there's some company culture. I can understand the intention. Some company cultures have that, right? There's really a big company culture, whether it be drinking and so on and so forth. Can you imagine you're putting that person in that, and the person would say, I know I probably shouldn't ask this, but do you? That kind of thing. Right? So are you really? Yeah, that kind of question. So it's usually very difficult to maneuver and especially if you're new. But yeah, I mean, it's just, how do we build that kind of culture, the empathetic culture, right? And it's just very difficult also to build that kind of culture of empathy. And I like the word empathy. Yeah, I will use that more than kindness, or empathy and kindness. Let's put it that way. Yeah, but it is difficult because you tend to think that people are like you. You tend to think, if it doesn't affect me, why does it affect you? And you tend to think that way because your kind of circle are kind of people who are like you usually. Yeah. So you have to put in effort to kind of figure out or want to find out about another group. Yeah.
Okay. Just one last roundup, and also to sum up today, because we are going to have the TAFEP enshrined into law, right? So perhaps I'll go to both of you. Like, do you have any thoughts about it? And like, in your opinion, what are some items or things that must be in the law to help to stamp out or reduce the kind of racism that people experience at work? I will go to Shani first.
Well, my mini hope is there are clear guidelines on what you cannot do. And I know that's going to be baseline, but let's start there. And my hope is we stop practicing the habit of asking people what their previous salary is. Because to me, that is that ends up setting up inequalities in the long run. All it does is it helps snowball an initial bias that might have led to, like your example just now, a Malay person getting $200 less, a woman getting 80 cents on a dollar, right? And that would just keep growing. So sort of things like that. Sort of things that, like, you cannot ask someone about their race. Like, we sort of just need to have what you cannot do and be clearly stated there. So then the small companies know, they don't know the reason yet, but they know they start at the cannot do first.
Okay.
And then we start conversations around why cannot. So that's my hope.
That sounds great. How about Shamil?
Yeah, just to build on the conversations, I hope that the TAFEP would encourage actually conversations. I think that is, to me, the main point of it. I mean, other than obviously, having a bit of a punitive action for those really the really bad ones. Let's put that way in a very simple term.
The outright,
the
totally
one,
no, yeah.
You have to whack one, basically. Yeah. So basically, the idea is to really set this tone that this is not to be tolerated. This is the way we're moving forward in Singapore, and is to have these conversations. And I hope that, in the TAFEP thing, this idea that before it even leads to this legal bit, it has multiple avenues for mediation, for talk and everything else, right? Because that is important. That is really important. It's one thing to just to hammer somebody, say, okay, you did something wrong, and therefore, but that it might be just underneath that, you're not dealing with the issue, right? The root of it, whether it be the prejudice or particular stereotypes and so on and so forth. So I hope that it leads to conversations. With regard to, the baseline and the law, obviously, those things about, ensuring that there are no more ads that say bilingual speakers, right?
Oh, yes.
Which is very common. It's I think one of the most commonly cited example by my participants previously for different projects, bilingual, this one. So, and if there is, hopefully there is some kind of way to know whether it is valid or not, right? Because, surely, if it's a shop that, sells, like, for example, bakwa or whatever, right? I understand why you might not hire a Malay Muslim person, right? But so there's a legitimate reason, you know what I'm saying? But there might be other instances like, why do you need a bilingual person for whatever job, right? So I hope there is some kind of mechanism where a person, if they want to write bilingual, then they have to
justify.
They need to justify, get permission.
Explain why they need the person to be proficient in the other language.
Yeah, right? I hope that happens. Yeah, but the only issue about that is that then the person might do during the interview. Right, so the ad itself will be all open, but during the interview itself, then there's another. Yeah, so I hope Khalafat can think of the different stages in this journey, in the work journey, right? Whether you be looking for a job, during the interview, during the job, so on and so forth, so forth. Yes, there are multiple stages that they have multiple challenges that we can. I hope Khalafat looks into lah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. I think we have some main points here about being empathetic, having empathy, and also I think the last point about being more aware about the different work stages. I think that's a terrific point, and definitely about the baseline guidelines about what are the really hard no's that you should just not do, right? Thank you for joining us today, Shani and Shamil.
I've learned a lot from Shani in this short period of time. It's like fantastic.
I always love just having a conversation, and I think that's going to be the part that other people are going to enjoy if we can create more safe spaces like this.
Safe spaces.
Yes.
Yeah, I said, safe zone, is it? Yeah, safe spaces.
Same.
Yeah. But safe spaces sounds nicer. lah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks so much. On Diversity is a podcast inspired by the Institute of Policy Studies Managing Diversity's research program. We are available on Omni.fm, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Please follow or subscribe to the On Diversity podcast to get notified when we have a new episode. You can visit our website, ipscommons.sg, for more info.